Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We have moved into August of 2024. We are in the dog days of summer. We are getting ready to sort of end summer, get ready for the school year, get ready for the fall. But hope everybody's doing well. Another weekend perspective. And this one's going to be a little bit short. We're not going to get into a whole lot of stuff because partially there's not a lot of news. We will be doing Cloud News of the Month covering July here on the next show. So you'll get lots of news and notes and all those sort of things coming up. But there was an interesting sort of set of stuff that happened this past week that, you know, is not terribly unusual, but did feel a little bit unusual. And that was, there was a huge push from lots of different venture capitalists, mostly Silicon Valley venture capitalists, to sort of come out and be very, very political about kind of their view of the world, their view of candidates in the upcoming U.S. presidential election in November, to the point of, putting together websites, putting together long form video, kind of stating their position on certain candidates. And this was a little bit unusual. We're going to kind of dive into a little bit after the break, but, it really kind of highlights the changing landscape in somewhat Silicon Valley, which we'll dive into, but more so just how embedded technology has become in our lives. And while technology has been, a huge part of our lives for many, many years, many decades now, computing in our pocket and 24/7, news and sports and all sorts of things that we can get through the internet and how we communicate with people. But it's now also, getting into other aspects of life in which, things like crypto and Bitcoin and other things that, are starting to push, perspectives, whether they are business-driven, personality-driven, to force certain people to be more political, or at least visibly more political. So I want to dive into that a little bit after the break.
AI may be the most important new computer technology ever, but AI needs a lot of processing speed, and that gets expensive fast. Upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is the single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. Do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic. Take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/cloudcast. oracle.com/cloudcast.
Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we've seen sort of an interesting tone change out of Silicon Valley, an interesting sort of new set of perspectives coming out of Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley has never been without its share of big personalities, its share of very wealthy individuals who, are able to command all sorts of things, whether it's, the largest tech companies, the largest investors, those types of things. But Silicon Valley as a whole has been somewhat apolitical. And I shouldn't say apolitical. Apolitical sort of implies that they have no sort of take on politics, but they've been, for many decades, sort of behind the scenes, sort of stayed out of politics, and to a certain extent, and this is never, kind of been formalized or anything, but there's sort of an unwritten rule that, much of what the technology companies, the technology individuals were allowed to do was sort of kept at arm's length from, getting too deep into the policies of government. And that's not to say that there aren't any policies in government that don't impact technology. There are tons and tons of them, whether they are, things that impact manufacturing of things like, hardware and hard disks and all sorts of things, whether it is rules about how internet monitoring works or censorship, whatever you want to call it, it's like Section 230 having to do with, free speech on the internet. We've seen things like Antitrust happen with companies like Microsoft. So, technology has not been, without kind of intertangling with with government and government policies. It's been going on for a long time. If you've ever worked with government agencies, if you're selling technology to government agencies, there are tons and tons of them. So it's not unusual for Silicon Valley to be interested and concerned about policies for technology. Obviously, governments are not just the United States. Technology is not just the United States. It is, happening all around the world. We've obviously seen lots and lots of things, whether it's GDPR or whether it's things having to do with, antitrust or app stores or other things in the news, fairly recently, whether it's, things like, who owns things that are open source or perceived to be open source, like Java code and stuff. So we see this happening, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the EU, whether it's in, APAC and how much, for example, China can impact APAC. But what's been sort of the wink, wink, nod, nod between governments and sort of technology sector is that because technology, at least over the last couple of decades, has been so instrumental in driving growth, in driving economic growth, in terms of driving large prosperity, trickle down prosperity, whatever you want to talk about, that the two sort of leave each other alone, right? It's essentially Silicon Valley would prefer to have very free markets for the most part. You can argue that there's ways in which they try and manipulate markets, and while government would prefer to, sort of see them, let growth happen, right? It allows the United States to not only have access to great technology, but it allows, that technology to be exported to the rest of the world and all sorts of other things. So, there has been kind of a hands-off sort of relationship between the two. Now, what's changed over the last decade or so is we've seen the reach of technology move from something that is essentially a tool, something that we interact with, to something that is much more involved in our day-to-day lives, right? And what I mean by that is, everything from, how, for example, social media can be used to influence elections, or deepfake might be used to influence elections, how technology can be used to influence, how people act within societies and how information is communicated. And those begin to infringe on things that, weren't necessarily perceived to be heavily technology driven. Now, granted, you've had technology used for communications and other stuff, but, you start to see, it impact elections. You start to see it impact things like currencies with things like crypto and Bitcoin and Ethereum and all of those and so forth. And so you've seen a much greater, kind of light be shined by governments, whether it's the United States government or other governments, upon the tech industry and how much it's impacting, day-to-day life, right? And at the simplest sense, that's sort of where we've begun to see much more kind of awareness and potential influence or potential regulatory interference, if you will, or regulatory involvement, with the tech industry. And I'm not going to go into all sorts of things. We cover parts of that on the show from time to time when there's interesting news articles. But this past week or two, there's been a couple of interesting things going on in Silicon Valley. And part of this is really just an extension of the venture capital domain, if you will, which we've covered a lot on this show. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about on this show a lot is, it's one thing to understand the technology. It's just as important to understand, the business side of the technology. And so you've often heard us, maybe not as much the last year or two, but, often heard us talk about, which VCs are funding which trends, which companies are getting VC funding, how much is VC funding impacting kind of the growth of technologies, how much of it is distorting the value of markets. So we've tried to cover that quite a bit. We've had a number of VCs on the show. So we've always sort of tried to pay attention to what they're doing in terms of money trends and influencing. And what's changed a little bit is, in the past, the VCs, to a certain extent, kind of stayed behind the scenes, right? They were, raising funds, raising capital, investing in companies. But, oftentimes they would sort of stay behind the scenes, that whatever work they were doing kind of stayed behind the scenes. And then they would, either reap the rewards or deal with the losses of companies either growing or failing, as would happen within the VC space. But what happened over the last 4 or 5 years, and maybe a little bit more, is they've been trying to be much more visible. And we've seen this, with a number of them, whether they are on Twitter, talking about themselves or talking about their companies, trying to talk about their perspective. Obviously, some of it is sort of, selling and trying to, encourage new entrepreneurs to want to work with them more so than anybody else. Part of that is just a a natural, essentially marketing within a competitive market. But some of it has become, very personality driven, right? We're seeing, people like Jason Calacanis and some others on the All In podcast is one of the most popular podcasts that's out there. We've seen A16Z try and create their own media sort of conglomerate, if you will, to get away from having to push their stories through traditional tech media channels. We've seen a number of VCs, try and be much more visible than they were in the past. So all that aside, none of that has to do with politics until we kind of get to the last couple of weeks. And we've seen kind of a renewed, sort of a new, I don't even know what the right word is. It's not really a trend yet, but it's sort of a blip in that we're seeing more and more VCs try and be very visible about what their political takes are. And again, this is, not that they weren't in the past, not that they weren't maybe fundraising or contributing, but these are very, very wealthy individuals. These are very well-connected individuals. And I think what we've seen is they are seeing certain trends happen in politics. And part of this is, having to do with, we've seen kind of more extremism in politics, whether it's on the right or the left. We've seen this, around the world. We're seeing more and more people trying, from a government perspective, trying to drive quote unquote accountability in terms of, whether wealthy individuals are paying taxes, whether it's, our companies have become companies become too large? Does the government need to be involved with things like mergers and acquisitions so that we don't create, antitrust type of concepts? And all those can be debated. There's lots of people that talk about that. But it's been very interesting to sort of watch how outwardly vocal both sides, both the left side and the right side, are becoming. And I only highlight all this stuff not because we're, on the show, we're trying to take a position one way or the other. I think we've very much realized that in general, technology does very well when the underlying, technology in the sense of being able to be a disruptive force in the industry or within ecosystems or just within general society tends to do fairly well when, some of the underlying things are relatively stable. Right. When the world gets sort of crazy, whether it's financially or politically or, in some cases, weather and things, it's a little harder to then make, disruptive technology something that's going to be top of mind. But, we're seeing more and more of the VCs. And I think this is one of these things that for us, it'll be very interesting to watch and see if this matters, if this moves the needle, if what's driving it. It does feel like, to a certain extent, there are certain potential political issues that are on the table, and those impact, less about your politics of, human rights and things along those lines. It's more sort of business centric things, right? Like, are we going to have governments that are more strict about antitrust? So, for example, if you're a VC, you would love for the ability for your companies that you invest in to be able to have exits that don't necessarily have to be IPOs, right? Like, lots and lots of companies have gotten acquired by larger companies. If those larger companies are being strictly watched for potential antitrust, that makes it difficult for the VC market, right? We've seen some proposals of taxes on wealthy individuals, and one of the ways that they're proposing doing that is potentially, and again, this is complicated, taxing individuals on unrecognized, gains, unrecognized capital gains. And again, the reason for this, and there's lots of debate about it, is the idea that many, many wealthy individuals. So let's just take, for example, somebody like Jeff Bezos, who has, owns lots and lots of shares of a company, has lots of equity in a company, and instead of actually selling those shares and then, paying capital gains on them, what they do is they tend to hold on to them and then borrow against the perceived value of those assets. And in doing so, they're able to essentially avoid taxes on, capital gains, what would be capital gains. And again, all that's perfectly legal. It's just, the proposal of potentially taxing unrecognized capital gains becomes, it's a complicated thing, because you're then taxing people on valuations that aren't necessarily distinctive. They haven't necessarily been taken yet. But it's a discussion that's happening. Again, how far it'll go, where it'll go, it's a very, very complicated thing. Becomes from a VC perspective, a very difficult thing to deal with in terms of, we they use things like equity, future potential of the company to be an incentive for people to potentially join the company, to potentially take risk and those types of things. So that's on the table. And then obviously, there's lots of discussions going on about what the future of AI looks like, how much regulatory, governments will impose upon AI or upon the potential of AI. There is, things like the future of currency for things like crypto, which, can feel like a big deal sometimes, can feel like a niche sometimes, but, could have, large ramifications if policies are made one way or the other, right? So I think you're seeing more and more of that. It's very interesting to me that it's not being done more behind the scenes, through various lobbying mechanisms and so forth, and maybe that's happening as well. But it does feel like we are hearing from VCs more so than we ever did. It will be interesting to see if that moves the market in any way, shape, or form, whether that moves political sentiment one way or the other. Most of these folks, probably do a lot more work behind the scenes than they do in front of the scenes. And it is sometimes unusual to see people who you mostly think of in one distinct domain in terms of technology, becoming more and more political, and whether or not they really want to get out there and sort of put up with the slings and arrows that happens when you sort of delve into the political realm, more so than just being in the sort of technology realm where, the scoreboard is dollars and so forth. So anyways, it's something to just kind of keep an eye on. We don't really have a stance one way or the other. We're not in the venture capital space. We just sort of pay attention to that space again, because it is one of the drivers amongst many that influences the future of technology. And so we like to pay attention to what's going on there. So anyways, short show. I put a bunch of links in the show notes if you want to kind of pay attention to what's going on there. Again, we don't have a stance one way or the other as to what VCs are doing, but it is interesting to watch kind of both sides of what is this evolution of Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley's relationship with governments, whether it's the U.S. government or other governments. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody is beginning to enjoy August, enjoy the last sort of month of September, if you're, the last month of summer, if you will. And for those of you that have kids, enjoy the last few maybe visits to the pool or a little bit of a vacation that you might be doing. And so with that, we'll wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.